Die Diaspora spricht.
Parlando.
Diaspora
Conoscere.
Falando.
Diaspora sono de parler.
Diaspora spreekt.
Diasporas speaking.
Përshëndetje, my name is Rina Limoni and I am the host of Diaspora Speaking. In this episode, I am joined by Dr. Gëzim Visoka to discuss his research on statehood, Kosovo's struggle for recognition after independence, as well as his latest book, The Derecognition of States.
Welcome to Diaspora Speaking, Gezim.
Thanks, Rina. Great to be here, and thanks for having me.
As you might have heard, we start the conversation with 3 questions. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And what do you do in your day-to-day?
I was born in Podujeve. It's a small city in the northeast of Kosovo. It's a border city. I grew up there until I moved to Pristina to pursue my undergraduate studies in 2004, I believe. So yeah, I grew up during a period when we had parallel education, parallel state, and I was lucky in a way to experience that unique trajectory of Kosovo's becoming a state, then the war and the NATO intervention. So I was educated under the UN administration, sort of my high school, and then moved to pursue my studies during a very critical period for Kosovo, which was definition of its future political status. And then eventually I left in 2009 to pursue my studies abroad. And then ever since I've been living in Ireland. But in the meantime, before that, I worked for civil society organizations and a few other sort of agencies, which has had a profound impact on my sort of intellectual trajectory later. In terms of my day-to-day life, I rather have at the moment simple and uneventful day or life in terms of sort of physical everyday life, but it's very vibrant and stimulating in terms of the academic thinking, writing and talking. So I am devoted to my family and work, and I have really little space for my own personal social life. So I drop the kids to crash in the morning, and then I start the day and I'm there until evening, and that just goes on and on.
And then just on the side, you're also an associate professor.
Exactly, and that's a nice refuge. Sort of when you have young kids, going to work is a form of your own sort of break.
When we first spoke, you told me that after your MA, you went back to Kosovo and worked there as an advisor. I can imagine this had an impact on your worldview, considering that critical stance you take or the critical literature that you are exposed to during postgraduate studies. How did this shape your view on Kosovo? Because you went then to the University of Dublin to do a PhD.
So as part of my MA studies, I had achieving OSI, Open Society Scholarship, and there was some sort of, commitment or obligation on our side to go back to Kosovo and give back at least for a year or two. So I did not go immediately after my MA studies, which were in European politics at the University of Sussex. I started my PhD studies at Dublin City University in Ireland, and then during my field research in Kosovo, while interviewing for my thesis, I sort of got to interact more with diplomats and officials from the government of Kosovo. And that's when I decided to be involved for about a year and a half max as senior political advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kosovo. So it was kind of, resident position, but also I had to move back to Dublin and do my field research for my own thesis. And that was a very formative experience. I was at the beginning of my career, my research career, and basically I was experiencing the everyday life of diplomacy, everyday life of intervention, behind the scene politics of a lot of things that I just had started to read a year or two earlier. Yeah, so certainly working for Kosovo government during that period as an advisor was a very formative experience that to this day I'm still processing it and trying to articulate it in different forms.
And this articulation plays well in your research because the state and how the state evolves or digresses in ways that we are experiencing now, the world stage in different regions of the world, is something that concerns you. You're very much interested to see how a state acts and why they act in a certain way. And how does a real state act? How is this an everyday event?
I guess you're referring here to the difference between recognized and unrecognized states. So I suppose coming from Kosovo and having had that sort of, research experience as well as participant sort of action research type of engagement with diplomacy on the ground as well as abroad, it has given me a rather complex but much richer understanding of statecraft, state making, state becoming. In that sense, I have been intrigued to understand how states think, how they act, how they perform in everyday life, because states are nothing but sort of, everyday encounters and events. I suppose understanding how real states act is not a science, it's like an art. So it's about reiterative and sort of, a reiterative performance of resemblance of state-like functions. So it's a quite twisted sort of situation where the state is not real, but it's a metaphysical creature, but we make it real through the acts of lawmaking, performing, decisions, speeches, speech acts. All of that sort of, are what makes a state. So I'm interested to know the micropolitics, the micro moves that give meaning to statecraft. And I suppose when it comes to the everyday events and what determines and what shapes statehood and state becoming in this realm, I have had the privilege to study Kosovo closely to understand its diplomatic approach and tactics it has used to consolidate the international standing. And so in one of my books, Acting Like a State, I kind of provide a full first-time account of Kosovo's sort of, everyday diplomacy and performative diplomacy, the efforts it has undertaken to penetrate an international system which has been very much inhospitable, exclusionary towards states like Kosovo, but also other entities who are outside the UN system. In the book and also in other works, I demonstrate how Kosovo had to kind of more or less had to perform a guerrilla diplomacy, very much overcoming and operating in a different tempo, the different rules, different logics, overcoming the barriers and sort of, obstacles that formalities of international bureaucracy or membership rules set. So Kosovo very much had to perform its statehood through improvisation, through penetration of loopholes in the international system, through sort of, associations with alliances and allies, and various other entanglements as the only way to survive, thrive in an environment that is not really, welcoming to new states. And that's that's something that has kind of, informed my own understanding of world politics, which is very much hierarchical, exclusionary, and unfair to states like Kosovo, for me, which are second-tier colonized entities that throughout history have never benefited from decolonization or the same treatment that many other states have received in their pursuit of self-determination and state-making.
You speak of an environment that is not welcoming to new states, which then means there is a fight for external recognition, which in traditional international relations mean becoming part of the international society. Can you expand some of Kosovo's efforts to become part of the international society?
Yeah, so despite meeting the Montevideo Convention criteria for statehood, which is sort of having a population, a territory, a functioning government, and capacity to engage in international relations, Kosovo has also shown commitment to democracy, human rights, minority rights. So all of these sort of objective and subjective criteria of statehood Kosovo meets. But despite all of that, it still faces obstacles when it comes to UN membership and full universal recognition. And that sort of springs from two sort of streams of states. Serbia, who directly challenges Kosovo's independence, backed by Russia, and then other states such as China, as well as sort of other regional European powers, Spain and Greece. All of these sort of obstacles have created the conditions for Kosovo to really have a more difficult trajectory to international membership. So without universal recognition, Kosovo had to engage in a country-specific diplomacy or bilateral diplomacy, targeting countries individually, and then also trying to build temporal alliances and supports for membership in each organization. So it has focused in identifying countries that might be willing to recognize Kosovo, in working with third countries to sort of, to kind of establish contacts, and also finding loopholes in the membership criteria for organization. So that's kind of one of the novelty about Kosovo, is that, despite failing to cure membership in the UN, which it hasn't actually applied formally. It hasn't, so which is an interesting story in itself, but it has been very successful in finding second orders, regional organizations where membership criteria were more flexible and prone to change. So in my work, I kind of conceptualize Kosovo's efforts to become part of international society through two approaches. One is through bilateral recognition, and the other one is through membership in international organizations. And with regard to the first one, I kind of conceptualize 4 steps that Kosovo had to undertake for each recognition it has secured. Because in Kosovo news or international news, we only used to hear that moment when a declaration of recognition or a news broke out, and it was a day of celebration in Kosovo for everyone. Whereas in Serbia, it was a mourning day and pity and so on and so forth. But behind the scene, for securing one diplomatic recognition, Kosovo had to work at least for 1 or 2 years. So that remains usually unrecognized. And the unspoken heroes here are not foreign ministers, presidents, or prime ministers who had the privilege to come out and announce these recognitions, but there were diplomats behind the scene who would wake up at 5 a.m. to try to reach out to their counterparts in specific Asia or elsewhere. So that untold story of unspoken, unsung heroes, it's something that often bothers me that Kosovo hasn't really recognized sufficiently. But that's a different story. But when it comes to the stages for recognition, so Kosovo had to be very much open-minded and send requests for recognition to all states of the world, with the exception of North Korea, perhaps, or Iran, which was aware that if it receives recognition, it will be more troublesome than offering any benefit. And then it had to really pursue various ways to establish international contacts. That meant to knock on the door of our allies and see who are the friends of our friends. And so anytime a foreign minister would come to Kosovo, Kosovo would have a list of 10 countries that we thought, or Kosovo thought, would be able to open the doors for us. So it had to really find informal, personal, diplomatic channels to talk to foreign ministers of other countries. And that would go on and on for months and months, if not years, until some sort of official meeting is established, some sort of, bilateral cooperation is undertaken, and then eventually the formal recognition would come. But every recognition that Kosovo has received has been a long-term struggle. And one issue that I have with Kosovo media and public is that they always attribute them to US and our allies. But they undermine and underappreciate Kosovo's own effort. And my argument is that, yes, these recognitions would not have been possible without the support of US and European allies, or Turkey and other non-Western allies. But if it wasn't for Kosovo's perseverance, proactive diplomacy, and trade-offs that it had to make, none of that would come. In the book, Acting Like a State, I kind of demonstrate clearly that in the first year, Kosovo received around 50 recognitions. And perhaps those were the ones that were granted as part of the Ahtisaari package, where Kosovo took under commitments to implement the Ahtisaari proposal. In exchange, it received recognition from most of European allies. And so it was a coordinated declaration of independence, and it was expected that these countries will recognize Kosovo. But any recognition that went beyond number 50 to 117, they were absolutely co-owned by Kosovo and international allies. Kosovo was behind that lobbying process, and it had to pay a price for that. So that's something that I try to reflect in my work, to recognize that effort that often is unappreciated.
You speak unappreciated efforts, and you used unsung heroes. And I think in unsung heroes, we can also speak about diaspora. In your research, you also speak of everyday diplomacy, and in this, the diaspora plays a significant role. What was the role of the diaspora from the late 1980s onwards in the effort to make Kosovo part of the international society, long before Kosovo declared independence?
Yeah, certainly Kosovo's diaspora, Kosovo Albanian diaspora, was critical in kind of hosting the government in exile, in hosting the resistance groups, but most importantly in internationalizing Kosovo's issue during the 90s. So from an internal problem of Serbia to something that deserved international diplomatic intervention. And that wasn't an easy one, because there was a huge reluctance and resistance to include Kosovo, let's say, in the sort of, international conference for the former Yugoslavia and Dayton sort of, package. So diaspora really played that role of serving as informal diplomatic representatives of Kosovo abroad. But they didn't stop there. They continued that sort of effort to support state building process during the UN administration, and then the campaign for recognition as well. As part of my research, Kosovo's diplomacy and recognition efforts, I've come across remarkable stories that no one knows in Kosovo, that, for example, Kosovo Albanians working for UN in East Timor were behind the recognition by this country, because they were there lobbying and raising the issue, sharing the histories, the stories, and playing a crucial role behind the decision, let's say, of East Timor. Or more recently, we're learning now that Albanians fighting against Assad regime are lobbying for the recognition of Kosovo by Syria. So certainly, these unsung heroes in diaspora are also crucial to be mentioned. And diaspora, even this week, as Kosovo marked the 17th anniversary of independence, we've seen their proactive role, for example, in US, through proclamations that we have received, that Kosovo has received from cities, states. I just finished another book on sub-state recognition, which looks at sort of, recognition of states by cities, councils, regions. And I mostly look at the case of Armenians in US and Somalis in Somaliland, landers in UK, and in those instances the diaspora has been crucial fire behind the sort of struggle for recognition. And even if the state dies, like the Republic of Artsakh in Nagorno-Karabakh, diaspora and sub-state recognitions that they secure from sort of, their local communities and representatives keeps the story, the struggle for statehood alive. So certainly diaspora are crucial entrepreneurs and change makers when it comes to states that are suppressed, peoples that are suppressed, and their rights not equally treated.
Pyesin zogjtë mali, nuk me lënë rehat. Pyesin ata pyesin, sikur nuk e din, ku shkojnë kosovarët, pse në Kosovë nuk rrin. Pyesin ata pyesin, sikur nuk e din, ku shkojnë kosovarët, pse në Kosovë nuk rrin. Detit po të shkojnë, dita mbëket natë, pyesin valë të detit, nuk me lënë rehat. Pyesin ato pyesin, sikur nuk e din, ku shkojnë ulqinakët, pse ulqin nuk rrin. Pyesin ato pyesin, sikur nuk e din, ku shkojnë ulqinakët, pse ulqin nuk rrin. Sharët po të ngjiten, heci ditë të natë, pyesin zogjtë e malit, nuk me lënë rehat. Pyesin ato pyesin, sikur nuk e din, ku shkojnë petovarët, pse në Petov nuk rrin. Pyesin ato pyesin, sikur nuk e din, ku shkojnë preshevarët, pse në Preshev nuk rrin. Nga do që të shkoj njeri pa fat, ëndrat për atë dhejën, nuk me lënë rehat. Zjonin ato zjonin, dhe sigur e din, zemra ime në thot, do të kthehem në Prishtinë, do të kthehem në Prishtinë, do të kthehem në Prishtinë. Ka do që të shkoj njeri pa fat.
We're now 17 years since Kosovo declared independence, and to stay with the internationals a bit longer in this conversation, the Kosovo news cycle is filled with the relationship with the internationals, and considering the changes in the US government particularly, and how, for instance, we will have an election in Germany and other European states, a move to the far right, meaning, as someone in this podcast also said, the people who granted Kosovo the green light for independence and who intervened in 1999 are no longer in government. We have a different scene internationally. As someone with deep subject expertise, how would you describe the current state for Kosovo?
I suppose, on the one hand, I have a lot of admiration for the Kosovo people, society, for their sort of, resilience and perseverance, despite constant challenges posed by Serbia, never-ending international interventions, unfair and unequal treatment internationally. But I also have a lot of frustration with politics there. I often say, because there's a maxim in foreign policy should be an extension of domestic policy. And I argue in the case of Kosovo, it should be the opposite. Foreign policy should not be an extension of domestic politics. It should be a domain that is preserved from the partisan and party politics. It should be a national state interest that is not negotiated, is not traded with party politics. But anyway, that's another story. But with regard to Kosovo and its relationship with the internationals and challenges it exposes currently, I suppose, again, it's important to highlight that the international community has been crucial for Kosovo's journey to independent statehood. But as part of this journey, a relationship of chronic dependency has emerged, which has inflicted in Kosovo's collective memory and identity a sense of subordination towards the internationals and a deep sense of self-doubt and anxiety. So this issue of anxiety is really important. That's because any time there is a threat that the international community will pull out the attention, the support, there's a panic, collective panic in all domains of life. And I understand to a certain point why that is the case, because we are outside the UN system, we're partially recognized, we have open issues with Serbia, and we're not self-reliant and self-sufficient state yet. But that collective anxiety is certainly sort of, something that is coming back now with Trump, what's happening with Ukraine and threats of pulling troops. These days we hear in news whether US will remove troops. So my reading of the situation is that we have to be very cautious because statehood sovereignty is reversible. So you have to perform, you have to enact it, you have to regenerate it, you have to kind of keep it. Otherwise, if you don't perform it, if you don't enact it, there's a risk that it will unravel in an unwanted direction. So it is about time that Kosovo shows some smart statecraft and overcomes party politics and divisions and undertakes some strategic moves, which involves diversifying a bit the allies, signing security partnerships and deals, engaging in sort of, bilateral security treaties, Turkey and others. In case US withdraws troops, in case Europeans have to focus in dealing with Ukraine, there are alternative allies in the region that will help Kosovo protect its borders. One good thing about NATO presence in Kosovo is that partially it is under the UN framework, so it cannot be withdrawn or undone easily without the consensus of all member states in the Security Council. And the second one is that it is run by NATO in practice. Because for the UN, it's called international military presence. The KFOR is just a sub-implementing partner. So in other words, if Trump wants to end NATO presence in Kosovo, it cannot, because it has its UN mandate. And if UN wants to undermine, let's say, Russia, China, even US, they can't, because it is run by NATO and doesn't have to be necessarily US. It can be other NATO member states, such as Albania, Turkey, Italy, others, filling the ranks and supplementing that sort of, military presence. So in that sense, I don't think Kosovo should, worry too much, but it has to be proactive in filling potential gaps that emerge in this new world order that we are experiencing as we speak now.
And this new world order is clearly, we will be seeing how it evolves, is an unmaking of the current geopolitical order. And with that, you mentioned also the reversibility of statehood. You recently published your most recent book. It's called The Derecognition of States. And I read from the preface is, this book is the first comprehensive study of the derecognition of states in world politics. For our audience, what is state derecognition in international relations?
I'm one of those scholars that I think, coming from Kosovo and the Balkans, where nothing is permanent, it has also foregrounded my intellectual thinking in world politics. Hence, I see things as reversible, as sort of, not only in progressive sense, quite skeptical, quite polemical. So I think that kind of, foregrounded my interest in this topic. And at the moment, I'm working on another project, which is on a more broader, looking at sort of the unmaking of world orders. So the derecognition of states basically entails when certain states suddenly decide to reverse their original decision of recognition. And so, but it's not uniform practice. It can take the shape of suspending recognition, withdrawing recognition is used. It can be freezing recognition, but it mostly concerns sort of contested states or partially recognized states who are outside the UN system. And in the book, I look at the case of Western Sahara, Taiwan, Kosovo, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, who have received different degrees or levels of recognition, but all of them have been exposed to this practice of derecognition. Yeah, in the book, then I go on and try to understand open-mindedly, by the way, for even though I'm from Kosovo and Kosovo has been affected by this practice, I want to do justice and fairness to this topic. And I come to a conclusion that in all cases, perhaps with some exception of Western Sahara, the original conditions of recognition have not changed. So it's counterintuitive to see derecognition happening because the conventional thinking is that recognition is irreversible. Once granted, it cannot be withdrawn unless original conditions of that recognition are no longer replaced. And that original condition is basically the non-existence of the state that you previously recognized. So in other words, Eastern Germany was a case of that derecognition because whenever they unified with the West, there was no more as such republic, or there was no case to continue recognizing Czechoslovakia because two states emerged, Yugoslavia and so on and so forth. So in none of the cases that I look in the book, we see vanishing of these states. But instead, what we see is actually former base state using military, economic, and political sort of tools to convince third states to revise their decision. So it's quite corruptive practice that third states, and we're talking about mostly about 15 post-colonial states who are in this business of renting, selling, or switching recognitions for economic, geopolitical, and security gains. And they are the one who are kind of troublemakers for me in the international system at the moment, especially, for example, for Taiwan, where the stakes are very high.
You are speaking about the tactics of state derecognition, what occurs behind the scene, what we don't see publicly often. But I am interested to know how might the politics of derecognition be connected to Kosovo's future or current politics, considering also that Kosovo has not received a single recognition in the past 5 years.
So the numbers behind the recognition of Kosovo are contested. On my books, when I mean my books and on my record, which I have a rich record of all these acts, I have about 18 derecognitions, but the Kosovo has returned about 5 or 6. Which it has never announced them publicly, fearing that then it will become a part of that game of switching back and forth. So we can conclude that there are about 10 countries who have withdrawn recognition of Kosovo. So that means that Kosovo has 10 less votes or 15 less votes when it comes to its application for membership in international organizations. Serbia's goal was all along to bring the number of recognitions under 2/3 of any required membership vote. So basically, the recognition for Serbia, it has the purpose of prolonging the Vučić and Dačić regime and legitimizing Tadić and Stefanović and other sort of opposition leaders. But for Kosovo, it was mostly about blocking membership in organizations such as Interpol or UN agencies. So certainly, it's about the numbers and it's about sort of undermining Kosovo's prospects to advance its goal to become a part of international organizations. And for Kosovo, the stakes are high because, as you said, we haven't had any recognition in the recent years. Partially, it is because of the recognition campaign of Serbia. And then Kosovo agreed on a moratorium for a year, not for derecognition, but for membership in international organizations, which is, again, something that was a misunderstanding in Kosovo. So Kosovo did not need to stop its recognition campaign, but it did stop, especially during the COVID time. And then when we had Kurti II government, for some reason, they decided to remove campaign for recognition from the priorities of foreign policy. I think partially it was their calculation that we don't really have much chance to get new recognitions. Partially, I think it has to do with capacities that new government had in place. So they prioritized other areas of diaspora diplomacy, bilateral cooperation with existing recognized states, and so on and so forth. But I think, like never before, Kosovo should go back to its pursuit of diplomatic recognitions, because it's not only symbolic in nature, but it has consequential aspects. Because the more countries recognize Kosovo, the more they will come to Kosovo's defense if something happens to the country. The more countries recognize Kosovo, the more it will have opportunities to join international organizations and hence expand its capabilities of statecraft. And most importantly, it is, as I said, keeping the enactment and performing of sovereignty going until you reach that, tipping point, which is membership in the UN. So for as long as Kosovo is not part of the UN. It has to keep the campaign for recognition going. And despite pessimism in Kosovo for new recognitions, I think with the proactive diplomacy, the one that was pre-2014, it is possible, and there are a good number of states that would consider recognizing Kosovo.
As this conversation is revealing, Kosovo is a constant part of your research. Even if you have comprehensively drawn on more global examples over the years, a curious question would be, how do you manage the inside-outside researcher dilemma, as you have to, in one way, confront the reality as an academic no longer living in Kosovo, but then when reading on Kosovo, and particularly reading narratives that are dehumanizing and at times patronizing, the need to defend may arise?
Yeah, so I suppose when I'm in Kosovo, I'm an outsider. When I'm abroad, again, I'm an outsider. So I'm somewhere in between. And it's I think it's a unique position. It has really shaped my positionality in academia quite a lot, but also it's quite challenging. So over the years, I've had to work hard to penetrate the really kind of, conservative international academia. Coming from Kosovo, there was a lot of stigma, a lot of sort of politics behind that. I've had gatekeepers who have, in the form of peer reviewers, who have blocked my work. But I've found ways, like Kosovo as a state, to penetrate and overcome those blockages. And then when it comes to Kosovo, I'm not sure how they perceive me at the moment, perhaps not as an insider or as a local scholar, but it gives me a unique position because I'm able to read, engage with archival material, engage with details, while also have the capacity to zoom out and theorize and draw on other contexts. So I'm kind of happy with that relationship I have with Kosovo at the moment, even though I would have wanted to do more on the ground archival work in that sort of sense. But it's going fine at the moment.
And I think this is a dilemma that is, I can imagine, enlightened when you meet like-minded academics who are from Kosovo. Are there any efforts, and if so, what are those in creating a Kosovo-Albanian academic network in the diaspora?
Yeah, so I think we go along well with one another. We're quite sort of spread in different countries. Certainly in Ireland, there are not many, so I'm one of the few, but I'm always sort of, open and willing to cooperate, and I kind of stay in regular contacts. There isn't any big network or kind of, association which is really kind of bringing together all the potential, which is, I would say, a missed opportunity. And then it is also a missed opportunity in the Kosovo side to bring us further closer to sort of various. So there are individual examples of universities inviting one or the other, but for example, I'm always intrigued to see the Academy of Arts and Science of Kosovo, how completely they disregard the sort of, a new generation of Kosovo Albanians or Kosovars abroad who have much stronger credentials academically and intellectually. They are completely overlooked by their sort of, conferences, membership, and publications. So it's like they operate in their own mini world, and that's pity. So when I interact with other diaspora scholars, I sometimes throw out the idea of creating a sort of diaspora academy or Academy of Arts and Science of Kosovo in diaspora, and sort of a bit of competition wouldn't do any harm, but certainly I think it would require some mobilization and organization to make that happen.
And that would be great for future diasporas, future generations to look up to. And this brings us to the end of this conversation. And there is one question I asked at the end, and the question is, if there is one thing you could bring from Kosovo to Ireland, what would it be?
I suppose I miss the sort of casual social life, but I don't admire the Kosovo journalist last-minutism. So, they one thing I don't miss about Kosovo is like when I get phone calls or sort of, last-minute requests for a media appearance. But I miss traditional food, obviously, including burek, good burek. We don't have good one here. When I see colleagues in London or in Brussels, showing pictures of that, I'm a bit jealous that we haven't reached that burekization level, but I remain in daily contact with friends, family. In the digital world, in the social media world, it's much, much easier to stay in touch.
I have to thank you for accepting my invitation and for sharing your research and knowledge with an audience of Diaspora Speaking. It was a pleasure hosting you today.
Rina, I also appreciate the effort and also once again congratulate you for taking this initiative. And I know it is very hard work that you're doing, but highly appreciated among us, because you're basically performing an oral history for diaspora community that is very much attuned with the contemporary dynamics of life. It's in digital format, it's a podcast. So certainly something that we all should thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much.